thing that I'm really curious about is it seems as though, unlike most people, or at least most Americans, you've had a lot of experience living, like literally living in other cultures. And so, what I'm curious about is how that has informed your writing in general, this novel in particular. That's what I'd really like to talk about.
Oh, what the difference was I clicked all the same things again, but this time it works. That's great. I have a confession. In my house, I'm known as the tech vortex. Anything like goes wrong. So I'm sure it's my end. So I'll take that.
So
I'm glad we're on.
how are things over there in Boise? That's where you are currently, right?
I'm in Boise. This is a place that has a lot of ski resorts and we don't have much snow. So the ski resorts are hurting. The farmers will be hurting in the summer because we don't have enough water in the mountains. Otherwise, weather is in the 50s. Can't complain about that.
So what, did Mother Nature send all the snow to France and the UK?
I
Is that what
guess,
happened?
yes, something like that. That's right. We just aren't, yeah, it's all over the West. I think Utah has some snow, but not much in Idaho, Montana, which you normally get many feet. And where are you located?
I'm in New York.
Fabulous. Very good. So you're the ones getting all the snow and bad weather.
Well, I'm actually from New Orleans, and one of the things that I learned about New York when I moved here 5 years ago is that New York State is large enough that different parts of the states have very, very different weather.
Huh.
So Syracuse, Buffalo, basically they're just like, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas down here in New York City in Westchester County, in the southern part of the state, that's close to New Jersey, because New Jersey is literally right across the Hudson. And so it's pretty mild, in my opinion, because I lived in Chicago for more than 10 years.
Oh.
And yeah, Chicago's weather is like terrible compared to this. So, I feel kind of lucky, actually.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
you
good.
know,
Very
so,
good.
actually, this kind of brings me to one of the things that really fascinated me about your Pop Match page. I saw everything about your novel, and I'd like you to speak a little bit about yourself and your novel. But the thing that I'm really curious about is it seems as though, unlike most people, or at least most Americans, you've had a lot of experience living, like literally living in other cultures. And so, what I'm curious about is how that has informed your writing in general, this novel in particular. That's what I'd really like to talk about.
Sure, and that's great. Let me apologize at the beginning here. My voice, for some reason, is raspy this week, so it's going to sound a little different than normal, but I will give it my best. But yeah, I love that. Have you also lived abroad?
Well, I did a study abroad class in Brazil. So I was there for 6 weeks. So we flew into Sao Paulo. We were in Curitiba for about 4 weeks. We did a little piece of it in Maringá. I don't know how familiar you are with Brazil.
No, not really.
But other than that, I mean, I've been to other countries, but not for any significant period of time, and definitely not to the point where I got to know the culture in any meaningful way. I think the thing that distinguishes me from what I see in most Americans is I've had to travel for work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've gotten to know more of the United States than Americans that I've met who have more experience abroad, because they tend to be bi-coastal. So they tend to be like, I have a friend who's been all over the place. She's living in Canada. She grew up in California. She lived in New York for over a decade. But she doesn't know anything about, the Midwest or the South or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, that's the thing about me. I know more about the U.S., I feel like, than other countries.
Cool. And you're so right there. Every part of the U.S. has such a distinct culture.
Oh
right?
yeah.
It's amazing, even within states. So, you talk about New York and all kinds of different places that moving even a small distance away, it can be so different. I've spent a lot of time in Germany. My husband's family is from there and also did a study abroad there. And what amazes me even more so in Europe is that not only you move 10 miles away to another village and the culture may be a little different, the language can be so different. The
Wow.
dialect can be different. So they may have for the same word, it may be completely different 10 miles apart.
Wow.
So when you travel from the south to the north of Germany, they can't understand each other sometimes. So they all have to speak what's called High German, which is sort of the standard Nebraska English. It would be the standard German. So they are forced into this more standard way of speaking because within their own villages and towns and communities, they can speak and we can't understand them at all.
Now, see, I knew you were going to say a bunch of things that are really interesting. So I want to stop you right there. Now, when you said that, it made me wonder because I did notice that in the United States, that's not really true of the United States. I mean, you do have different dialects. And the most hilarious thing in the world to me is when you're from one part of the US, you go to another part of the US, the accent is very clear, and the people are just like, accent? What accent? I don't speak with an accent. It's like, what?
You're right. You're right.
But do you think it matters in terms of the way the country operates for it to be the way we are, which is basically we have a national popular culture,
Really?
or it definitely feels like we have a national popular culture. I mean, one of the things that really struck me about driving around Manhattan is how weird it was because I felt like I'd been there before.
Huh.
And it occurred to me after a while that the reason is because a lot of the movies that I've seen was shot in Manhattan. And a
Okay.
lot of the events that really like stick in my head, like I distinctly remember when the second tower was struck of the World Trade Center, there was this scene that I saw over and over again where some people were walking down a particular street in Manhattan, and you can see like the rolling dust coming down the street. I was on that street and it felt like, I mean, I immediately remembered that as if it was my memory,
Oh my goodness.
and I was just like, oh my God, what was it like? Because I was literally just walking down the street. So just like everybody else, they were just walking down the street. They didn't expect the
Yeah.
tower to collapse,
Mhm.
So what do you think about that, especially considering all of the issues in the US? I mean, we do have a national popular culture. We have culture wars, but even when you hear like people on quote unquote both sides, they're using the same slang.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no confusion as to when he used that word, what did he mean? So what do you think about that? Like, how
You
does that play
really
out?
I guess I want to argue, and I'm trying to think of how to argue, because I'm not. I think you're right that we have many of the same words. I'm wondering if, though, when different people use the same word, they may not conjure up different things in their mind. And an example, it's not a word, but these days, just the flag, the
Mm,
simple way people think about the flag. It's one country's flag, but the way some folks may use it and
right.
talk about it is quite different across the board. So your question earlier was, is it better? I don't think we can put a better or worse, any kind of a judgment on how one of
Okay.
these cultures operates in terms of, is that a better way to be? That's just the way we are and the way we're developing. And I would have thought, always did growing up, think that the melting pot of the United States, or this garden salad, however people want to talk about it, of having people from different backgrounds, cultures, and everything, was an advantage. And I say that partly because of being abroad. I remember being in Japan for a conference, academic conference, would have been around 1990. And at that point, the Japanese it was booming, but they were starting, I think this was the time they were starting, no, everything was great. And everybody was learning from the Japanese, business wise. That's my background. And 10 years later, I went to a conference, same sort of conference, same type of academics, Japanese, all over the world. And at that point, Japan was going through some economic trials. They had an aging workforce, and they're not replacing still.
Hmm.
So how do you solve it? So that was one. Women typically, once they joined the workforce, had to leave when they married or had children. So that
Hmm.
part of the workforce wasn't even available. And then the Japanese are not open. They are, I wouldn't go so far as to say xenophobic, but they're not open to immigrants. So the discussion at the conference in the side rooms was, how do you Americans do it? You have more people, a more diverse workforce, and more diverse country. How have you absorbed people? How have you brought them into the workforce, into society? And they were asking us. And to be honest, I was a little bit proud. I, said, oh, well, yeah, we've had our struggles and we still have our struggles, but we think it's really important for people to come to the US. And
Hmm.
been a place that people want to come. Fast forward so much of the work that I did in Vietnam, I remember one time people talking about wanting to go to the US, and there was a concern on the part of the Vietnamese government that their talent would leave, go for graduate study, and not return. And I said, well, how do you deal with immigration here? And they said, no one wants to come to Vietnam. Now maybe that's changed, but it
Hmm.
was so for such a long time we were seen as a place because we were so different and all that. Now, we don't want to get off into politics, but I think it's a shame that that's not seen as a positive attribute of this country anymore. And because we can learn so much from different cultures and be so much more open-minded and curious, frankly.
Well, I think the reason why we were able to be the way you described the positive US for so long is because another thing that struck me about traveling around the US is how you can be in your area, and just like you said, different regions are very different, but they actually feel really distant. Like when I had to travel for work, I started off in Chicago, and then there were a bunch of training courses I had to take in different places. So from Chicago, I drove down to Louisiana, right
Oh,
across
yeah,
Pontchartrain Lake, where
yeah,
I grew up on the New Orleans side.
yeah.
I was right on the other
I
side of
lived in
Pontchartrain
Metairie
Lake.
for a little while, so I know New Orleans.
Wait, what's that? You were
I lived in Metairie for a little while.
okay, okay, okay. Yeah, so I ate as many oyster and shrimp po' boys as I possibly could because
Yes,
I knew I wouldn't
yes.
have it for a while. And then I drove from there to Alabama, and I was there for a week. And I drove from Alabama to Texas, then back to Alabama, and then I started working in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Wow.
And so you know I mean, I don't know if you've ever driven through Texas.
Yeah.
Texas is huge. And so it took me 2 days to drive through Texas. By the time I got to Albuquerque, it really felt like I was in like almost a completely different world. I mean, this desert landscape. Albuquerque is unlike any city I've ever seen, where most cities, when you say the city, you're actually talking about the county that surrounds it. So when you say Atlanta, you're actually talking about all of the counties around Atlanta, Smyrna, Mableton, and all that. Same thing is true with Phoenix, Arizona, Chicago, Illinois. It's like you're talking about Cook County when you talk about
Yeah,
Chicago, but
no.
people don't realize it. Albuquerque is really just Albuquerque. I mean, there's the desert and then there's Albuquerque. And I think I had no idea what was going on in Albuquerque all those years, living in Chicago, growing up in New Orleans and stuff like that. And I think that's the reason. And social media is the thing that created this ability for people to think they know something about people somewhere else. They don't actually, but they think they do. And they form very strong opinions as a group about this other community of people somewhere else. I think that's really
Mhm.
what it is.
Mhm. You talk also about you have experienced not only different places, cultures, whatever, but the landscape, how important that is.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
the Texas, the Albuquerque, and as you know, spending time in the West, so west of the Rockies, let's say, people people do. I think the sky is bigger. Simply,
Yeah. Yeah, it
grew up
is.
in I spent time in New York and Western Massachusetts, in New Orleans, in the middle, so Arkansas, so kind of on that half of side of the country. And there were deciduous trees and fireflies and cardinals, birds, and very, very lush. Moved to the
Hmm.
West. I spent time in Seattle, and now I've been in Boise for a long time. This is the high desert. So from here north to Canada is all trees and forests. From here south to Mexico is all desert. So we're right there in the
Wow.
buckle. But I do think mindset might change a little bit. A fellow here who's a longtime friend, entrepreneur type, he said, when I was back in Boston, I was telling people about starting a company. They said, why would you do that? And in Boise and California, they'd say, well, why not? And so there's an attitude, maybe because we have more space
Hmm.
and the sky is big. And so this openness in the past, I think it's changing a little bit, but it has been a freer kind of place. I say now I could never live on the other side of the Rockies, mostly because of humidity, but also there are pockets and I'm making generalizations just like you're telling us we do, but there are pockets of places where people are pretty closed in what they think. That's happening in Idaho, always has been here too, but we've had had an ability to be more open as a very conservative state these days. That's not the same, not as much as it was before. Anyway, I'm
Well,
getting off.
people may not know. I think what you're referring to is the American Redoubt. That's what you're referring to? I don't know
Yeah,
if you've heard that term. So yeah, that is fascinating. You know, this attempt to basically create a separate country with
yeah,
Idaho and part of Oregon,
Oregon.
you
Yeah,
know.
it
It
is.
seems like
Yeah,
the Oregonians are just like, no, that's not going to
yeah.
happen.
No, no. There's so many strange ideas, aren't there now that just stranger than fiction. Yeah.
Well, speaking of fiction, tell us a little bit about your book.
Well, as you know, I've spent so much time before we leave this. So I want to pick your brain and think about this. I was just on a trip with my husband in Patagonia, and we were in Tierra del Fuego, which is the end of the earth, they call it,
Hmm.
most southern part of the world until you get to Antarctica. Traveling with some really smart people, and at dinner one night, I said, "Why do you travel?" And they gave pretty normal answers: because I can, because I want to see everything I possibly can, all this. And one person said, I travel and then I see what I bring back and build into my own way of thinking, behaving because of how I travel. And I thought, and I write now and then I write short blogs about things. And I did a little one about what have I brought back over the years of traveling. I was writing about traveling abroad, but it could be anywhere. You think about having been in Alabama and Texas and Albuquerque. What did you take back to Chicago? What did you take back to New York? And I think there's several things, but one in the end to me was I hope I've become better at observing and not judging right off the bat. So for years, my university has taken executive MBAs, Masters of Business participants, to Vietnam for a week. And I always give the same talk right before we go. I say there are 3 A's you need to do. One is absorb. Simply let it in, take a notebook, take your phone camera, but take a notebook because within 48 hours, what you're seeing and feeling and experiencing will be normal. So get that down fast. So absorb. And then ask like crazy, what does this mean? Why do you do this like this? How does that happen? And then finally analyze and try to say, okay, this is what it means in this culture, and maybe this is something I could take back. But to try, instead of saying, well, that's not the way they do it in Boise, or the water went out this morning. That's not good. So no complaining, no comparing, just absorb what's there. And I hope that that's part of what I, over the years, have learned from the travel, especially since I've spent 30 years working in Vietnam on and off. Come away from that place thinking, what do Americans think? What do they know about Vietnam? People my age immediately think of the war, which of
Right,
course
right.
the American war in Vietnam, because they've had so many, you have to pinpoint which one. So older people think of the war, younger folks say great vacation spot, great food.
Hmm.
And so I've written a number of books, nonfiction and fiction about Vietnam, or one fiction, but one of my kind of goals now is to help Americans primarily, but anybody who's interested, learn about Vietnam beyond those surface level observations. And so to learn about the culture, to learn about the people. On the one hand, culture is different, but in many ways, people are people. We worry about our families the same way. We want to
Hmm.
have a good job. We want to succeed. We want to do good for other people, whatever that might mean. And so to show some of that through this fiction book, and now I'm working on another one and a half, but that's kind of a goal, is so that living, especially living there, but then traveling to other places, every time I go someplace I think, wow, am I smart enough to come up with a cool story that would help give people a sense of what this is like? And then I have read so much about other authors who have gone, and not a lot of time, some of them spend a couple of weeks, some spend 6 weeks, some spend many years, but they're able to capture an essence, probably not the essence, but an essence of a country, of a culture, and I would like to be able to do that better, I should say.
Yeah, I know. I mean, actually, your 3 A's really sounds familiar for in terms of the trip that I took to the class that I took in Brazil,
Yes.
because Joselie Macedo was the professor who handled that class, and she essentially said the same thing.
Good.
And, one of the other things that you said that really resonates with me is you do, or at least you can. I want to say that I've heard of people say that they had a bad experience on a study abroad trip, for instance, but most people have good experiences. And one of the things that I really walked away from that trip, I kind of fell in love with Brazil.
No. Right.
And I realize now because this was back in 2007, so this was way before Bolsonaro. This was way before everything that's happened.
Mhm.
I actually saw some of the things that I discovered about Brazil actually explain what's happened there politically since then, because I did meet a lot of evangelical Christians in Brazil, and
Mm,
I didn't
mm.
expect that. But then again, their poverty sort of makes it easy to understand because you had people who were literally been living on the street since they were little kids,
Yeah.
So I mean, you kind of understand. But yeah, I definitely felt like I didn't want to leave. It's,
Mhm, mhm.
it's like, wow, this is great. And so I think that is one thing that can happen to you, and I think
Yeah.
happens. And the other thing that I thought about when I came back is, as I met more and more people who were from other places and seemed to almost like not notice our faults in a way,
Uh-huh.
because I've met people who, have immigrated to the United States who like speak very highly of the US. And I'm just like, well, I mean, have you noticed the
Mhm.
politics? And, I understand that, thinking back to my experience in Brazil, because, when you fall in love with a culture in that way, you kind of want to, you sort of take it in. You look for the positives, for the really compelling, for the really interesting, for the creative, and so on. So what I really remember about Brazil is how you can go on Sunday to almost any restaurant. You have a guy who's playing the guitar, and he'll do that for hours like it's
Mhm,
nothing.
mhm, mhm,
One of the best jazz clubs, and I grew up in the city with jazz clubs,
mhm.
was a jazz club called Wonka Bar in Curitiba. And I mean, when I got there the very first time, a guy was on the piano. He played for about 30 minutes. That was a guest. That wasn't even the performance. That was a guy
Mhm,
who came to see the show.
mhm,
I mean, it's just amazing. The musicianship in Brazil is remarkable, and they just kind of
mhm.
take it for granted, it seems.
Do you
But yeah,
think
I definitely know what you mean about falling in love with a
Well,
place.
I think that's a really good point that we notice it because we are out of our element and the
Right.
stimulation is so great. And so we're taking in, trying to absorb so much of that positive, and sometimes we forget to do the same thing here. So
Right.
that's
That is
another
definitely true.
the other few years ago, I wrote a series of articles, short ones about I was trying to learn how to characterize a setting. And so I wrote a series of articles about behind the scenes at the fill in the blank. So I did a lot of work with our county jail, which was one of the best in the country. So behind the scenes at the county jail hospital, turns out it's
Hmm.
the second largest hospital in the state. Behind the
Wow.
scenes at a football game, Boise State has had it's the one that plays on the blue turf, has had a good football team for a long time. But everybody, those guys, the actors and the directors are on the field. What happens behind the scenes? So behind the
Mhm.
scenes at the zoo and all this stuff. And what it forced me also to do is to put those glasses on that your professor was arguing for: absorb, analyze, ask later, but just look at it with fresh eyes, which is
Mhm.
possible when we walk into a setting we don't know. So
Right.
my current goal is, okay, I go to Vietnam and it's so normal to me now. I have to work very hard to say, what am I seeing that's new and different? So my
Mhm.
notebook, especially those first few days, it's full because I want to start seeing things as a newcomer might to understand it better. So I think I don't want to get complacent in the way I look at things. And I think that happens when we know it too well.
Yeah, what you said about like doing that for your own country, I think is so true, because I think that's the benefit of driving versus
Yeah.
flying.
Yes.
Because, I was just kind of blown away by the Grapevine, which is this kind of canyon that you drive through. They call it a highway that drives between Bakersfield, California, and LA. They call that the
Uh-huh.
Grapevine.
Yeah.
And it's not really like it's beautiful in the same sense that Sedona is absolutely gorgeous, but
Hmm.
it's just remarkable to think about it. It has the same sort of grandeur that like the bridges in Manhattan have, which
Hmm.
in both cases, people are just commuting back and forth every day and they don't notice it. But I
Hmm.
mean, these bridges in the Grapevine and also here, like in Manhattan, they're built to handle like 10, 20 times as many cars as a normal bridge in most places.
Right.
I mean, just the scale of New York City is
Mhm.
amazing.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think, but I appreciate that because I grew up in New Orleans.
Yeah.
So,
Huh.
that's the reason
You're
why I
funny.
see it.
Well, so do you notice that your friends in New York don't notice it?
Oh, yeah, no, they definitely don't notice it. To
Mm.
them, it's just traffic,
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
and it's always super cold here, even though it's
Yeah.
like maybe 40 degrees. I'm like, you've never been to Chicago if you think this
Yeah.
is cold.
Yes. Yes.
But
Yeah.
but at the same time, I do think they do sort of appreciate. I mean, I didn't realize before I came here how significant the neighborhoods are here. You have people who just sort of appreciate the fact that the same guy who owned this, laundromat or fish market or wine cellar or whatever, since they've lived there, still lives there, and they've seen like children grow up and all that kind of stuff. I mean,
Mhm.
New York to me, which is different from what my understanding of the South, being a Southerner, is that New York is very kind of old school and traditional. And I
Mhm.
think it's because, people like when I first left New Orleans, I lived in Ohio, and people would say, well, do you speak any French? I'm like, well, it's like that was a long time ago. And the people that I knew who were Creole don't really speak French. They speak like a dialect of it.
Mhm.
Whereas in New York, you have like I've met people who were Irish who have been here for 20 or 30 years, and they sound like they literally just got here yesterday. I mean,
Mhm.
they still have their accent, Irish, Italian. You could just go through the long list because everybody from the world is here, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's because the communities here really do keep contact with some sort of
Mhm.
contact with the country that their
Mhm.
community originated in. I
Mhm.
think that's the reason. And what that's created is kind of this preference for and appreciation of things being the same or tradition. But it's New York tradition. And so you have all these
Yes.
cultures. So
Mhm.
traditional for them is for all these different cultures to interact and just accept each other. That's traditional for them.
And so I have always wondered, those neighborhoods, I have the feeling that they're pretty closed. So they're
Yeah.
not as welcoming to outsiders. I lived in Ohio. I did time in Ohio. I say
Yeah, me too.
flat, yeah, flat and humid, and it was a great place to be right at the beginning of a career. But I think there are places, and even Seattle. I remember people saying Seattle is a really hard place to break in,
Hmm.
maybe for a different reason than New York, because people come and go. And so there are certain parts of the
Okay.
country that maybe people will come and then they either, I mean, you fall in love and want to stay in Seattle forever, but there's so many that come and then move on to fill in the blank. And so you don't want to invest too much time or energy in getting to know people because they may not be around. I find that an interesting approach to friendship. Same thing when we moved to Boise in 1986, so 35 whatever years ago. Oh, 40. And the same, it was very closed, good old boy network, very old Western town, five families controlled just about everything. And people would, when you introduce them, they'd say, well, I'm a fifth generation Idahoan. And I'd say, well, I'm an Army brat. I don't fit in anywhere. I don't expect to. And so that sense of you'll never fit in because you didn't grow up here. Versus now, we have so many people who have come from the West Coast primarily during the
Hmm.
pandemic, and they're very proud of being here for 4 years. All the rest of it didn't say, "But you're welcome, we're glad to have you." So it's I think there are different pockets where it's fascinating. And I again, my I was in New Orleans as a child, so I don't know anything about it, but I've wondered about it because I went to college in New England. A very dear friend of mine from New Orleans went up there, and she went straight home when she was finished, got a law degree, and stayed in New Orleans. And I didn't understand that idea of going back to home because, of course, when you move around a lot, then there wasn't a clear place to go back to. So now I get it, having been in one place for quite a while. But
Yeah, and kind of to your point, I mean, you asked me the question is you said you would imagine that like these neighborhoods here are pretty closed, but it kind of goes back to what I was saying about like what you're used to because I
hmm
started going to this laundromat that's near here, near where I live, about I'd say maybe 6 months ago. And
uh-huh.
at first, I was doing the thing that, because part of the reason why New Yorkers are sort of, I mean, they're used to being around a lot of people.
Yes.
And when you're around a lot of people, like if you're ever in the subway in Manhattan during rush hour, you totally understand. It's like you just want to respect other people's space and hope they respect yours. Forget about like in Chicago, if you sit next to a person, they're not gonna not speak. They're gonna say
Oh,
something.
really? Huh.
Oh yeah, yeah. Chicagoans don't like dead silence. They really don't. And usually what they'll say is did you see the game?
Uh-huh.
And you're supposed to just know what the game is, right? Whereas here, you can sit next to a person for like 30, 40 minutes and they'll never say anything. They'll kind of act like you don't even exist. But I noticed the last couple of times I went to this laundromat, so now it's been 6 months, all of a sudden people have started talking to me, and I think it's because number one, I'm tall, and so you
Okay.
can't really miss me. But the second thing
Mm-hmm.
is I've been going
Mm-hmm.
consistently. I go once a week. They've seen this tall black guy. Who's this tall black guy? I mean, it's almost like a small town in that sense where
Yes.
I can
Yes.
imagine people are asking, "Who is that guy?"
Yeah. Well, and that's my other expectation is that these towns are like small villages, small towns. So
Right,
people
right,
look out
right,
for
right.
each other. So
Exactly.
a friend of mine who moved right after September 11th, he worked downtown Wall Street from New Jersey, moved to Los Angeles after that, said my job was going to go away. I wanted to change and moved out there 20 years ago, whatever it's been. And he said, could not get used to it. And took him 5 years. And he said, I think I figured it out. In New York, people are not friendly, but they're kind. If you need help, they're there.
Right.
People in LA are friendly. Yeah, let's have coffee. And you never hear from them. They're not kind. They won't support you again because people move in and out so much they don't know who to count on. What you have is longevity now in the laundromat. And so
Hmm.
now if something happens, you call and say, I can't get there, my cat's sick. They'll take care of your laundry for you. So it's wow, fascinating. You should write a book about all this. Probably your podcast into a cool book. Mm,
Yeah, but what your friend said, and it's interesting that he's from here and he has that observation, but it's totally true. It's like people are not like when he said friendly, but it's like they're not assertive in that way. The
yeah.
one thing about New Orleanians is obviously, you see it yourself, is we talk to people like we've known you forever. That's
Hmm.
really easy for a lot of New Orleanians. We just don't feel that there needs to be like this period of getting to know. It's like, hey, you're there, I'm talking to you.
You're
Whereas New York,
absolutely oh my gosh, one of my mentors was from New Orleans, and that was true. So why do you think that is about New Orleanians then? You just jumped
um,
in.
I'm gonna try and be self-reflective the way your friend was. I guess it's because you have number one, you have a lot of characters in New Orleans. A lot of really, um, um, yeah, and I think that's kind of it. I mean, New Orleanians are also like, I hear people say, "Oh, you're so, what does it say? You're so warm." Well, actually, New Orleanians are actually pretty blunt. so
Mm,
And so I guess, I can see how people from other parts of the country, at least especially since I've lived in the Midwest and here in the Northeast, how our bluntness, and then we're also kind of cynical in a very kind of make fun of things um, kind of way. And so I can see how that could be taken as warmth. When
mm,
actually what the person might actually be doing is they might be like telling you some truth, in a very funny, blunt sort of way, but it made you laugh or something like that.
mhm,
I mean, maybe
mhm,
that's the case.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, I think that's part of the reason. I mean, it's like there was no such thing growing up as people tiptoeing around the issue. There was no such thing as an elephant in a room, because if there were an
Mhm.
elephant in a room, that's the first thing everybody would mention. Whereas I did notice when I was in the Midwest, there were things that like you weren't supposed to talk about. And it's like the obvious thing. It's like, well, wait a second, why are we talking about this problem that everybody is having with such and such? We should be
Mhm.
talking about that. And people would be like, whoa. So I think maybe that's it too, is that, uh,
Mhm.
that we don't really have that in our culture, the elephant in a room, at least not in my
That's really
community.
interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. Well,
I'm not, I'm not saying
yeah,
that's necessarily leads to solutions to problems.
yeah.
But
But why do they? I think I still have it. It's been a long time, but there was a book a few years ago about the impact of geography and how people and culture. And so, in Seattle, there were so many people who moved from the Nordic countries, from Scandinavia to
Hmm.
Seattle and
Hmm.
Minnesota over time. And so they had this. When we first moved there, I thought, why do people leave their curtains open at night? You drive down any street and all the curtains are open. Well, that's what they did in Sweden. Apparently, everybody knew everybody else in business and so forth. So they just let it open.
Hmm.
Also, Sweden and Seattle, very little sunlight much of the
Uh,
year. Then you leave it
okay.
in for that
Right.
reason. And so,
Right.
but then it was also people stayed in their houses because of bad weather. So when you went out, it wasn't quite as friendly.
Hmm.
But we can speculate on all this sort of thing and come up
Right.
with
Right.
different reasons. And New Orleans is populated by people from other countries that were maybe more open and more blunt, and who knows?
But yeah, that's true. That's true. It's more like I think I've heard like one of our former mayors say something to the effect of New Orleans is less part of the United States and more the northern part of like the Caribbean. It's
Oh,
like it's like the northern part of South America and not the
yeah,
southern part of the United States of America. I
yeah,
mean, that's
yeah.
what he was saying. And I mean,
That
there's
makes
some
some
truth
sense.
to that. I definitely relate to
Sure.
what he's saying,
Sure, sure. So
you know.
what's the biggest thing that you have one other the flip side of the question of what does travel bring into your life? When you travel, do you leave anything there of you?
Uh, Yeah, I mean, I feel like I do, but then again, that might be because I'm a very confident person, so I feel like I leave an impression. I like to talk to people like this, and so I had a lot of interesting conversations, and I spent a lot of time. Like there was Rosalie Macedo, who was the professor. Of course, she is Brazilian, so she's
Uh-huh.
fluent in Portuguese. But we also had a teacher's assistant, Hanada, who's also Brazilian. And so I spent less time with the other students and a lot of time with Hanada and one of the other students, and we met more Brazilians that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so with her assistance, and this is when I was just really annoyed by this thing in our culture where it's less common for people to be multilingual.
Mhm.
That was just it almost felt like a deficiency to me. In fact, there was one moment when we ran into some exchange students from Italy and like Hanada and like the Italian students and this other friend of mine, who was in the class, they were all speaking multiple languages. And when they wanted to include me, they had to switch back to English. And I was just like, damn,
Mhm.
that's just I hate that. But Hanada made it easy for me to kind of have some really interesting conversations with people in Portuguese, you
Mhm.
know. And so there's just a whole lot of things, I mean, first is that whole thing of, where are you from? So they're thinking American as if the whole country is the same. And I would say,
Mhm.
well, I'm from New Orleans, assuming that they knew where that was. They'd
Did
be
they
like,
not?
new.
Oh, that's
They
surprising.
no, a lot of it's really surprising how many people don't know. I mean, that are familiar with New Orleans. Now say New Orleans, Louisiana, and it was hard for me not to say it without being a little bit insulted. It's like, what? You don't know
Yeah.
where? You
Yeah.
don't know?
Yeah.
You've never heard of New Orleans, Louisiana?
Right.
So then it would be an opportunity for me to sort of, describe the city, my culture, the difference between New Orleans and other parts of the country, and so on and so forth. And so I hope that it sort of broadened the perspective of some of the people that I met as to the United States. Now, who knows what they think now, but,
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
the time, I hope that it had that effect,
Mhm. Mhm.
you know.
You mentioned the language issue, which I totally agree with you. When I studied in Germany for a year, and I was the worst student out of the 20 that went, I think. They tested us when we got over there. Most of these people had great language. I studied for 1 year before I went, and I decided then, excuse me, can I step away real fast?
Yeah, yeah, no, go ahead.
You know, my dog wants out here. She's a good companion, but she knows it's almost dinner time. So, um,
Okay.
anyway, my German just was great. And as I say, I'm fluid. I can say anything I want to. I have to do it in odd ways, but I'm not fluent. But I
Uh,
can hold my own. And so when our children started arriving, we adopted first one from Korea. When he started to speak, I said to my husband, let's speak German. So he spoke German and then switched to English, learned how to do that. Then we adopted a child from Thailand when he was 5 years old. Here's a kid who shows up speaking Thai. He joins a family where we're speaking German and he had to learn English. And he did. It took him longer, of course, to learn everything. Then those two kids spent a semester with me in Vietnam. and it came time for them in an international school. They came home the first day and said, "Do you know everybody speaks more than one language except the Americans, and we
Yeah.
speak German." And so they had to choose which languages to study in the school.
Uh-huh.
And they came French and Vietnamese, and they came home and said, "No problem. We already speak French and German and English and Thai and Spanish." And even though it was a few words, the lack of fear about learning a language was so wonderful to see in them. And
Mhm.
it just continues. So I think, and that back to different cultures, as you know, learning a language really opens you up to why do things work that way. And so,
Exactly.
yeah, it's so helpful, just so helpful to know that in Vietnamese, in Japanese, they have how many levels of honorifics. So you and I have to figure out how we address each other based on age and status and where we went to school and all that. So that's another reason New Orleans is nice just to jump in.
Yeah.
That
I
makes people
totally
uncomfortable. That would make people uncomfortable from some of those cultures, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said about opening your mind. And I also believe, like, there are people I'm sure who would listen to this conversation and think, oh, that's a very kind of hoity, kind of attitude
Yeah.
about, education, all this kind of stuff. What they may not appreciate is this isn't an educational issue for people in
Mhm.
other parts of the world. I mean, it's literally, it's almost like a necessity when you
Yes.
have like small countries that share borders with a bunch of other small countries. And then maybe there's a dominant country that's really close to them. And
Mhm.
so there's kind of a necessity there, number one, for us to kind of get along with the
Yeah.
people in these other small countries. And then we all are compelled to learn the
Right.
dominant country's language
Right.
because
Right.
they're the dominant country. And so it's not like everybody in these small countries has a PhD. The opposite, usually. And
Yeah.
so to me, it's a cultural thing.
Yeah, and it's an
It's
economic necessity for some of them. Yeah.
well, and on our end, it's not something that we have to all of a sudden like make everybody here super well educated to do it. It's like we've kind of made this choice
Mhm.
that we're not going to value people being multilingual, even though we have pretty much everybody from everywhere in the world here in the
Yeah.
United States living somewhere. So
Mhm.
that's the thing about it to me. It's like it's kind of a choice that we've made.
Yeah, but you also nailed it right at the beginning when you said who knows how big this country is until they've driven it. And
That
so
is
when you
true.
talk to people,
That is
except
true.
maybe Brazil, we were in Chile, in Patagonia. I know nothing about Chile. It's 4,000 miles long and maybe a few hundred miles wide, but it's different, so different from north to south as
Right.
well. And
Right.
so, especially the US, and I don't know if anybody drives through China or Russia, but people who have come here and have done it, you said 2 days to get through Texas. I mean, that's like a country in much
Right.
of the world. Well, I think nobody understands how big it is, and that's another reason we don't learn other languages, probably, is we haven't had to.
Yeah, no, no, I think you're right about that. I definitely think you're right about that.
Crazy.
So, do you want to talk about your book?
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah. So I've actually written two novels, and on the first one, I realized since I'm a longtime professor doing research in my real world, you go out, you have a question, you go out and you collect data, you analyze the data, you report on the data,
Uh-huh.
nonfiction. And I tried to do that about 10 years ago, trying to learn how to write fiction, and I thought I'm not a good liar. I can't do this. And someone said, no, no, no. It's your imagination, not just use your imagination. And I thought, I don't think it works like that. So I learned on the first novel, I needed a concrete case. And I started with a case in Australia of a woman who had killed her four children under the age of two. And it was, and fast forward. Anyway, I set that in the US and it worked much better. I had something concrete to start with. In the Vietnam Art of Lies, it was the same kind of idea. There was an exhibition in Vietnam, I think in 2000, I want to say 17, of paintings that came from France that had never been seen in Vietnam. They were by Vietnamese painters. Everybody was so excited. They came down to Ho Chi Minh City. It opened, and it turned out of the 18 paintings, 17 were counterfeit, were fake.
Oh, well.
And I thought, oh my goodness, here's a country that's kind of known for counterfeit shoes, purses,
Hmm.
DVDs in the olden days, all of that software and so forth. And here's a real case of art crime, art fraud. And so that's what started it. And then, so from there, I was able to just build it out. And it allowed me then to talk about that whole art scene. I got to learn a lot about museums and art fraud and counterfeiting. So that was fascinating all around the world. Looting of art that happened in Vietnam, happened in a lot of African countries. And so that was fun. And then to build in some characters that showed family relationships. This woman who's single mom, divorced, lives with her parents and son. So all of that, friendships among women her age. A foreigner was in the book, so she could ask the really strange questions about Vietnamese culture, and they could explain them all to her a little bit. So it was a real interesting process from the research angle. And then it was a way for me to start learning more, continue to learn this fiction writing. I've been a nonfiction writer for some 30 plus years, and I thought it can't be a big deal to shift. I have so much respect for how real hardworking, successful, even not successful, but fiction writers work. There are so many different balls in the air with character, with setting, with dialogue, with what's going on under the surface. My goodness. So I had no idea. And so, but it was really fascinating to work on. And so now I started on another one last year that was going to based on a real case out of Ohio, I think.
Hmm.
But it is so complex. I thought I'm not ready for it. So I'm going to do a simple one this coming year, work on that so I can really work on getting character down and plots. So I think I'm work on one or two things at a time on these books and just see what I can learn from them. And I'm having a ball. I mean, when you get into something, whether it's music or doing this or writing, and you lose track of time, then you know you've hit something. And
Yeah, oh,
it's doing
absolutely.
that.
I mean, yeah, so much fun. And let me say, to make sure you know if this is true, for me, I don't understand how people write nonfiction because
Wow, really?
yeah, I mean, it's just hard for me. The thing that, and what I'm talking about is like essays, or sounds like
Yep,
you
done
probably have
that.
written like parts of like textbooks and stuff like that. And so, the
I agree with you. No, that's not fun. No.
but even with essays, like, I mean, obviously I have strong opinions, but the problem with trying to put it in an essay for me is that I have a hard time knowing, like, think in terms of the emotional beats. Like you talked about the characters and all that kind of
Mhm,
stuff. And usually I
mhm.
have in mind some situation that I'm leading up to, like a crescendo, right? And it's just so hard for me to think that way when it comes without like actual people in the story. It's hard for me to think of nonfiction in terms of a logical progression or a story. I know what I would say. I just don't, I
Yeah.
just think in terms of like, how do you put it on the page?
Do you know the term or this whole field called creative nonfiction? Have you ever
Creative.
heard of that?
I mean, I've heard that, I mean, the term sounds familiar, but like
Okay.
what
So sort of the first book of that nature was In Cold Blood. Do you remember that one at all? Did you ever read it?
that title sounds familiar, it sounds like The Devil in the White City maybe is what you're
Yeah,
thinking
that sort of
of.
thing. That's creative nonfiction. So basically, there's a nonfiction something event, and you apply creative writing aspects to it. So building up tension, building up
Hmm.
the characters, all of that. So yes, I've done some of that, and that's why I thought, okay, this can't be that hard to switch to fiction. But I think that they both have more. It's really about creating the setting, creating the people, building a
Hmm.
story, fiction. And so they do have to build it up, the crescendo and all that. I wonder, I suspect you have loads of examples from the laundromat, from the subway, something that's very small that to me a little essay is, and I do real short ones, but it's to make some kind of a point, but it starts with a very small story of some sort that you can build up and carry along. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's not the fiction versus nonfiction. It's me getting better at creative writing, I guess, would be all the components that go into it. And I've done some creative nonfiction and writing books about culture and leadership, and one
Hmm.
that's about is profiles of people in Vietnam. So I've
Oh,
used
okay.
it, but it's always felt comfortable because the people were real. So now to
Right.
move to how would I write something I need to have your face in my mind as a character. And so that's where I am now is how do I actually figure out and who can I use from real life and then adapt versus I cannot come up with things out of nowhere learning that. But
Hmm.
I think I was just listening before we talked it's a new to me podcast interview of writers, and this one woman is known for writing short stories. And she said, "That's it." I thought I'm a short story writer, and then she started doing a novel, and she said they're actually different. And so now she says I
Oh
like
yeah.
working in different, very different genres and I never write the same book twice, so they're all really different. And I thought that would kind of be my goal. I'd like to learn how to write a bunch of different things. So I did this series of essays or profiles. I've done other things that are creative nonfiction. I've done short essays, longer essays. And so now is the time to go into more traditional fiction
Hmm.
and some days I feel like, why? But I get up in the morning. We all need a purpose. And that's right now. I officially retired from the university this semester. And I thought I need something new to work on. So during the pandemic is when I got started on the fiction. And then
Okay.
I have a family of tennis players. They all play. They're very good. They've always said, Mom, you need to learn. And I would take lessons for 2 or 3 days and say, I'm better as a cheerleader. I'll just watch all of you. I started a few years ago, 3 years ago, to try and learn how to play tennis.
Hmm.
And I think the best thing about trying to learn tennis, trying to learn fiction writing, and still teaching very smart executive MBAs is that it put me in the mindset of being a beginner again. So
Hmm.
I can talk about leadership context, strategic management, culture, whatever it might be. And I know this stuff. To them, especially engineers, they're completely out of their zone. So I
Uh-huh.
had to throttle back and say, okay, how do I convey this to them? I can talk, but that's not the best way. How can I find 3 or 4 ways to get this idea across to them, different approaches, but remember they are beginners. And so that has been really helpful to think of when I'm the expert trying to give somebody information, how do I do it? Just as I'm frustrated when I'm trying to learn how to hit a tennis ball and they have to tell me 100 times what to do. So
Okay.
it's that crossover, I think, of how people learn that's so interesting too. And
Hmm.
you said several things already I wanted to jump on. I think one of the most important qualities, whether we're here or traveling, is curiosity, which you clearly have, that you want to learn about other places, other people, other ideas, other types of knowledge, and then you link them. And so right now I'm trying to notice in my own thinking, how do I find and then link dots from different areas, different fields, different ideas?
Yeah. I mean, because obviously I've done quite a bit of traveling in the United States, but honestly, that was because I needed to work.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the reason why that was the motivation to do it. The thing that I've always loved about fiction is that you can travel literally
Yes.
anywhere in
Yes,
a book.
yes.
And I'm just guessing that most of my favorite books have taken place like at other time periods and in
Uh-huh,
other countries,
uh-huh.
and I just love being in these other
Yes,
places and like being in the mindset of someone who's very, very different from me, who's
yeah,
dealing with a completely different world and
yes, I
completely different
agree.
circumstances. I
Totally.
just absolutely love that.
It's what it should be.
I just always had this very strong love for fiction.
Mhm.
That's
Oh,
just
that's
that's just the
wonderful.
way it is.
And you've got some great fiction writers from New Orleans, really
Oh yeah,
old-timey
yeah, yeah.
ones and yeah,
Well, like I
love it.
said, we're it may not be easy to see, but we're actually pretty blunt.
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
You know,
absolutely.
mama's
Great.
gonna tell you what you need to hear.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
That's just
Absolutely.
the way it is.
I
So
tried of course, I ate red beans and rice a lot living down there, and I tried to make it the other day and no. So I'll have
don't
to
worry
work it.
about it. I cannot make red beans and rice. It's
Okay.
just
Not the
I
way your mom
cannot do
did
it.
it.
I think the problem with me and New Orleans dishes is that my standards are entirely defined by my mother.
Huh.
So, I mean, if I can't make it taste like she makes it,
Yeah.
it's a failure. So I don't
Yeah.
even tried a couple of things. I'm like, oh, this isn't even close.
Yeah.
No, and
Yeah.
so I just completely given up.
How funny. How funny.
Yeah.
Well, this has been wonderful. I appreciate it. I don't know if you got what you need.
Oh no, this is a great conversation.
Mhm.